Today we're talking about JPEG versus RAW and which file format you should be using for your landscape photography. So you'll often hear landscape photographers ask each other, are you shooting in RAW or are you shooting in JPEG? And what does that mean exactly? So what we're going to do today is take a look at RAW files, what they are, what JPEG files are, what the differences are between the two, and which one I recommend you photograph in for your landscape photography. So let's talk about the RAW file first and what it is. So a RAW file is simply the uncompressed, unprocessed image of all the data that your camera sensor captures. That's it. That's what it is at the end of the day. No compression, and it captures all of the data with no image processing done to it. So how does that all sort of work? Well, at the high level, light comes into your camera, your sensor captures it. Now it's digital, so it's having to capture data and converting it into just digital information. And that RAW file contains that unprocessed digital information that your camera sensor captured with no decisions made to it and no compression. So it has a high level of detail in it, both in regards to tonal values and in regards to color. And because it contains all of that information, it allows a lot of flexibility when it comes to editing once you take the photos off of your camera if you've shot in RAW. A RAW file typically is 12 to 14 bits of data per channel, and what that really means, what it boils down to, is it can just capture more information than, say, a JPEG can. So that extra information a RAW file contains just lets that file contain more information about the tonal values, giving you smoother transitions from darks to lights, as well as deeper color depth so that you can have more subtle variations in the color as opposed to something like an 8-bit file, something like a JPEG file or something like that. Again, all leading towards the flexibility you have in the editing process when you're editing a RAW file. And the way this information pays off is, let's take a typical landscape scene. A lot of times you'll have some dark shadows, some bright highlights, and you're trying to balance the two. Your camera sensor can only capture so much range between the two. But with a RAW file, you're getting all the information that your camera sensor can capture. So if you're a little bit over on your highlights, be careful, because highlights are the hardest to recover. If you go too far over, you might be able to bring some of that detail back in, unless you've completely sort of blown the highlights or overexposed the highlights. Now, if you get into the shadows, a lot of times if you're trying to capture an image that has a wider dynamic range, those shadows might be a little dark on the dark side. Well, with a RAW file, there's still a lot of data in there, and in your post-processing software, because that data is there and hasn't been compressed or removed from the file, there's data to sort of bring that exposure up in a slightly more clean manner than you might get with other file formats. This also helps you when working with colors, because you have that additional data allowing you to have more information about the colors that are in the image so that you can work with it in your post-processing software. So at the end of the day, all that extra data in the RAW file has not been processed or compressed, just gives you more flexibility when it comes to the editing. Whether it be maybe you messed up an exposure and you underexposed too significantly, there's a much greater chance you'll be able to fix that with a RAW file than you will with some other file types like a JPEG, where it's already been processed. One of my favorite things to do is when I take pictures, a lot of times I have a set white balance. I tend to set 5500, 5600 Kelvin, something like that, and I will adjust it in post. With a RAW file, you can completely make your white balance adjustments with very little ill effect. Whereas with something like a JPEG, it's discarded a lot of the data, so you can't make those white balance changes as easy. That's something you need to get more accurately in camera. So for me, a RAW file gives me a lot of flexibility in the editing process and helps me recover images that I might have messed up out in the field because I messed up a camera setting. Now, RAW files aren't without their cons. First, they are large because they aren't uncompressed, and so when you're capturing all that data, the file is much larger than, say, like a JPEG would be. Because they're larger, you may need larger memory cards or take more memory cards out into the field to make swaps. I typically don't find this a huge problem, especially in landscape photography where the rate of photos is much, much slower than, say, maybe an event or something like that. But it is something to consider, and if you're going to shoot in RAW, make sure you do have memory cards big enough to let you get out there and spend a day out shooting and have enough room on them. This also trickles down into long-term storage, because now you're going to get home, you're going to pull those RAW files off somewhere and maybe to a local hard drive or to an external SSD. Those files are larger, and over time they will consume more space. I think these days it's not quite as problematic because storage is significantly cheaper than it was, say, even 5-6 years ago. But it is something to be aware of if you're extremely space conscious or really struggling with disk space, is those RAW files will consume more space on your storage systems from the time you capture them all the way through your process. And another con to RAW files is you do have to do some form of processing with them in order to share them or, put them in your website gallery or anything like that. As we noted before, RAW files uncompressed and unprocessed. So a RAW file coming straight out of the camera is going to lack contrast. It's not going to have any processing done to it. Even the sharpness can be a little soft because it hasn't had any sharpening done to it. Your camera hasn't done any sharpening or anything to it. It's all being left to do once you've taken the file off the camera and run it through some processing software. So before you can share them, you need to pull them into an image processor to add that contrast. But it also gives you the great opportunity to really work with that file, make sure your detail in the shadows is just the way you want it, make sure you haven't blown any highlights, lets you control the sharpening level on the photo to the look that looks good to you and what represents your work. So just keep that in mind. For landscape photographers, I don't find this a huge deal, because our rate of photos is a lot slower, I think, than a lot of other photographers. We sort of get out there, set up a scene, take a picture, probably take multiples, but when you get home, you're probably going to just choose a handful of images to actually edit. So you can take your time and really sort of work through that process to get the image to look just like you want. The RAW file in its uncompressed, unprocessed state gives you plenty of flexibility for that. Again, allowing you to potentially save exposures that weren't quite right, or bring up areas where it was a little darker than it should be, or maybe potentially save some highlights if they were just a little too bright somewhere. But it is something to be aware of, that if you're going to shoot RAW, you do need to do some post-processing on your images before they're ready to share. Now let's talk about JPEG files. So JPEG files, if you shoot JPEG on your camera, so you've gone in your camera settings and said you want to shoot JPEG, what is happening is the same process happens. The light comes in, hits your sensor, camera gathers up all the data, but your camera has an image processor, and it's applying what it thinks makes the image look better. And that means it's going to sort of take that raw information, it's going to make some brightness adjustments, it's going to make some contrast adjustments, some saturation adjustments, and it's probably going to apply a level of sharpening to the image as well. Now it may come out great, and the decisions it made may look perfect, and you're good to go. But it has made these decisions for you. And then the next step is, because it's saving it as a JPEG, it's going to compress this file. So what it means is it's taken its decisions, it has what it thinks is good, and when that compression happens, you lose some of the data that your image sensor captured. So in those highlights, it's sort of discarding some of that information. Same in the shadows, it's discarding a little bit of that information as part of the compression process. So you sort of have to have faith that your camera is capturing the image just the way you would edit, or very, very close to the way you would edit, because it's taking that raw data, processing it through its image processor, making those brightness, contrast, shadows, highlights, and sharpening adjustments, and then with the course of the compression, it's discarding that additional information. So what's that mean? Well, it means when you take that JPEG off your file, you can make some subtle tweaks to it. If you're within ballpark, you will have enough data there to make some small adjustments to it. But if you need to, for example, really save this blocked up shadowy area that's just black, most likely a lot of the data has been discarded as part of the compression process because the image processor didn't think you needed it, and now it's going to be really hard to bring that up without introducing more image artifacts to it. So there's just a little bit less flexibility with a JPEG. While yes, it comes out looking better than the RAW file straight out of camera, if you don't agree with its processing, or it made an incorrect choice, or something didn't mesh with what you want it to look like, you don't have as much data in that file to work with and post-processing to make those fixes, adjustments, or corrections, because all of those decisions the camera's image processor made are sort of baked into the file. Now with that said, there's some advantages to it. One, they take up less space, so your memory cards won't fill up as fast. Your long-term storage plan doesn't need to be quite as robust because the JPEGs don't take up as much space as the RAW files do. Additionally, you don't necessarily have to process the JPEGs. You could take them straight out of camera and start sharing them. There is a case where if I was shooting JPEG, I could just grab that JPEG off the camera. It's probably going to be good enough for a quick Instagram story share, toss it up online, and move on very quickly. But again, the JPEGs just don't offer a lot of latitude when it comes to trying to correct things in post or really pull out details in your image. So before we talk about what file type I recommend, let's jump onto the computer and we're going to compare two images. These are images I took back in, I want to say April, with my Panasonic G9, which I do have configured to shoot RAW and JPEG. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull up the RAW image and the JPEG image of the same spot, same time, and one is RAW, has all the data, uncompressed, unprocessed, and of course the JPEG, which has been compressed, and the camera has made some decisions about what it should look like and gave me the JPEG file. We'll compare those, then we're going to play with three things. One, we're going to play with the highlights between the two and see what we can do. We're going to play with the shadows and see what we can do, and then we're going to play with the white balance and see what we can do. So we're going to take a quick look at that, and then we'll follow back up with what my recommendation is for your file type for landscape photography. Okay, so what I have here is I have the two files pulled up. This is a waterfall I like to go photograph. Again, these are not portfolio worthy images per se. I was actually testing out the hand holding capability of the Panasonic G9 when I photographed these. But what we have here is on the left, we've got the RAW file, and over here on the right, we've got the processed JPEG file from the camera. Now, I do have the camera set to standard profile, so it's not doing huge changes to it. You can see there's a little bit of difference between these two. But what I really want to dive into is let's take a look at the highlights, because right up here, in the water, we've got some highlight differences, and the JPEG, it's actually brought the highlights down a little bit, but let's just sort of play with it here. So we're going to come over to the develop module. We're going to take the highlights of the JPEG, and we're going to bring them up. Actually, we're going to bring them down, see how much detail we can get. What I'm trying to do is, could I recover the detail from the highlights in these images? So we're going to bring it down. I'm going to bring it down. Let's just bring it down all the way, -100, and see. And this does bring back some detail. Let's pop over to the RAW file. We're going to bring its highlights down. Now we're going to go back to library, compare these two. So what's important to notice here is in the RAW file, I brought the highlights all the way down, and I see a lot more detail here. I get a lot more texture out of that water. It had more detail in the file. Over here in the JPEG, it did bring the highlights down. It brought them down even more. And there is some detail in there, but not all of it. It lost that data. It doesn't have it. So again, what I was able to do is recover a little bit more of the highlights in a clean fashion with the RAW file because all of the information is in there. So that's highlights. So let's take a quick look at shadows. So let's bounce this back out. I am going to reset both these files. Reset, reset. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to play with the shadows. And over on this right-hand side of the image, it's nice and dark. Not a lot of data in there. So what we're going to do is see what happens when we try to recover the shadows. So let's fit this back out. So I'm going to go to the JPEG file. We're going to bring the shadows. We're just going to bring them all the way up. Do the same thing on the RAW file. Now, I normally wouldn't do this aggressive of a change on the shadows or the highlights or anything like that. They'd usually be more subtle. But what I'm trying to do is just demonstrate what the data is in the file versus what is not in the file. So I'm making big swings with the sliders. I would not normally make this big a swing in post-processing. So we've got that. So let's bounce back to library module, compare. We're going to zoom in to the shadows. Okay, so what we've got here is we have the shadowy area. I've brought the shadow slider all the way up. And here, let's go ahead and take it to 200%. And as you can see, I've got the RAW file on the left, JPEG on the right, and the RAW file doesn't look terrible. I brought shadows up 100%. That's a huge leap. And the file doesn't look terrible. It's a little noisy because I brought it up quite a bit. But if we look over at the JPEG file, it just looks a little softer, starting to pick up these color tints that the RAW file did not pick up. And that's because it doesn't have as much data. So when I'm trying to crank those shadows up, it doesn't have all the data the RAW file had. So again, when you get into these really trying to recover something, really trying to recover those shadows, really trying to recover those highlights, or play with contrast, the RAW file just has that extra data to make it a cleaner process, give you a better looking file. It's not that you can't fix some of it in the JPEG, it just doesn't have all the information, so the image starts to fall apart the bigger changes you make to it. So let's go ahead and do one more test, because white balance is one I do play with a lot, because like I said earlier, I tend to shoot at like Kelvin, 5500, 5600, and then adjust white balance as I need to from there. So I do change white balance a lot, which is one of the big reasons I do like to shoot with RAW files. But let's dive in here and play with some white balance real quick. First, let's jump in, set these back to fit, back develop module. I'm going to reset the images, make sure they both reset. They did. Okay, so we're going to start with the JPEG, and I'm going to change the temperature. Let's kick that up about plus 60 temperature. So I'm bringing the temperature up, and this image already sort of just took on a completely nasty hue. Obviously there's some tint changes I could do, but I'm just going to play with white balance. Come over to the RAW file, change its temperature. Let's crank it up. I took it from about 5500 to like 11,000 Kelvin. So let's compare these two. Come to the library, compare. Okay, so now I brought these two into the library. We're comparing them. Again, I have the RAW file on the left, JPEG on the right, and just look at that. Huge white balance change, and the RAW file just handled it so much better. It still needs some tint work. It picked up some of the similar green hues to it that I wouldn't really want in the file, to push out. But I made the huge swing from like 5500 to like 11,000 temperature. So it really tried to warm it up. did the same or a similar change to the JPEG file, and it just sort of fell apart. It picked up this sickly green tint to it, and yes, I could play with the tint slider to try to change it, but just here you can see making those changes, more flexibility in the RAW file for that. So that's the comparison of the two files. Again, these were shot back in April off a Panasonic G9, and just comparing the RAW file to the JPEG file and sort of showing what large swings in the sliders do to sort of demonstrate how much more information the RAW file has opposed to the JPEG file. Okay, so which file format should you use as a landscape photographer? So I'm pretty sure you can guess which one I think you should be using as a landscape photographer. Pretty sure during the course of this video, sort of my bias and the way I spoke about each file obviously was favored towards one versus the other. And yes, I think as a landscape photographer, shooting in RAW is a huge benefit to you and helping you achieve those images that you can be proud of for your portfolio. And it's really because those RAW files give you so much flexibility, and you get them home and get them into your editing software. That flexibility lets me sort of save files that I might have messed up the exposure on. Yes, am I always trying to get the perfectly well exposed image when I'm out in the field? Yes. Do I sometimes still mess that up after all of these years? Yes. And because of that, that extra information the RAW file has just sort of acts as a safety net that I can probably save the file. Maybe not save it to the point of some big, huge, giant print, but I'll probably be able to put it on a website or put it in social media or something like that, or even print slightly smaller at home. And because of that tremendous amount of flexibility the RAW file brings to the table, that's why I think landscape photographers should use it. It almost acts as a little safety net for in case you have some technical error out in the field, there's still a chance you can save it. And if you do have a nice, well-exposed image when you get home, just having that extra data there just makes your whole editing process easier. So before I go, let me just bring up two other little side notes about RAW versus JPEG. One, if you're nervous about making the switch, most cameras can photograph in RAW plus JPEG these days, and that can be a great safety net for you. Configure your camera to shoot RAW and JPEG. Remember, it's going to take up more space on your memory cards, but it'll give you that opportunity to start practicing editing with the RAW file, but still have the JPEG in case you get frustrated. If you've traveled somewhere and you're nervous about editing a RAW file and you take this great shot and you just can't get the editing process figured out, the JPEG file that you're used to can still be there, and you can still have it either as a reference file to sort of how the camera thought it should be processed, to being able to just share it and cut your losses. So RAW plus JPEG is a great way to make that transition. And finally, I hear this a lot. A photographer gets back home, realizes they accidentally had their camera set to photograph only in JPEG, and they feel like their whole trip was a loss. And really, that's just not true. While I prefer the RAW files, JPEGs can work. If you took your time to get a good exposure out in the field, and you just need to make subtle adjustments to your image, if you don't need to make huge swings in bringing those shadows up, or if you didn't totally blow the highlights and lose all of that data, a JPEG does have the ability to be edited. You can bring some shadows up a bit, you can increase the contrast a little bit. All of those changes work. You just can't go quite as crazy with those sliders as you might be able to try to save something with the RAW file. So if you've gone out and photographed everything in JPEG and you're like, my pictures are ruined, they're not. You have a little bit of room in there to play. There's enough detail there to make subtle adjustments to sort of give that image your sense of style, your sense of flavor, and you didn't lose anything. So your photos aren't ruined. They just aren't quite as flexible as they would have been if you'd shot with RAW. So that wraps it up. That's RAW files versus JPEG files, sort of the differences between them, what they bring to the table, and which one I think you should use for your landscape photography. But I'd like to hear from you. What format do you shoot in? Do you shoot in RAW? Do you shoot in RAW plus JPEG? Do you only shoot in JPEG? Why? Why not? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd like to hear how you shoot. So I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and thank you for watching.